This is the 40th year that ACM has sponsored the Nick Adams Short Story Contest. It's the first time, though, that we've been able to orchestrate things that we can give the award for this great contest to the winner. The nature of this contest is that we open it up to all students in the ACM who submit stories of, I think we put a word limit on it, but they are initially screened by a couple of ACM faculty members, and then we send them off to a professional writer as our external judge. We had hoped that our judge would be here tonight. Regina Frangelico is a Chicago author who teaches at Columbia College and also at Northwestern University. She was unfortunately called away with some family business tonight and couldn't be here. Let me read for you, though, what Gina said about this year's prize winner, Clare Boerigter, whose story, Gusanos, was the prize winner. She wrote that this story strongly evokes both beauty and brutality in its landscape. It is at once spiritual and skeptical, sensual but pragmatic. The somewhat enigmatic narrator manages to achieve an intense humanity while also remaining slightly on the periphery of her own story, a recorder of events like her own camera's lens. The story's ending feels harrowing and earned. I second those thoughts. It's really a fabulous story. I would recommend that you go to the ACM website where there's a PDF version of it, and you can see for yourself what a prize-winning story in the Nick Adams contest reads like. Claire is a Spanish major at Grinnell College. She's a sophomore, right? And her story really, I think, fits very nicely into what we are doing here with this conference. It has an international focus. It has I think, a very aware focus on the complexities of culture. And it speaks, I think, to many of the themes that we were talking about today with self-discovery, but also with the kind of seeking for knowledge that so many of you talked about. So Claire, come on up and get your award, and congratulations.
Thanking the ACM and Regina Frangelico, who's the writer judge, and all the judges who are involved in this contest. I am really excited and really honored to have received this. I really enjoyed writing this story, and I'm really enjoying having this opportunity right now to talk to you about the different experiences that really informed and made this story possible for me. So I'm going to begin kind of with an overview of my piece, so you have a little context for what's going on. I'm going to go then and have a short excerpt, talk about the creative process for me and some of the technical aspects that kind of synced up with that, and then finish off with another excerpt. But before I start, I want to give you a little background on the title, because it's not a very common word. It's not actually an English word, it's a Spanish word. Gusanos is the word for worms, and throughout my piece, worms just kept popping up here and there. And in thinking about a title when I finished it, they seemed like the most logical choice. My story is set, though, in Latin America, and two of my characters are Spanish speakers. And for that reason, I did mix in a little bit of Spanish into the dialogue. And Gusanos really came out as kind of a unique way to relate the characters in the story together. So that ended up being the title. All right, so I'm going to go with a little overview of my piece. Gusanos is a short fiction piece about the evolving relationships between three climbers as they attempt to summit a mountain in South America. Told from the perspective of the expedition's unnamed photographer, Gusanos examines the hard but equally beautiful aspects of the natural world. It is within the context of this unforgiving environment that the three characters begin to show themselves. Mateo, the money behind the expedition, is preoccupied with his own death and at the same time perversely addicted to courting it. Cash, the hired mountain climbing expert with a knack for staying alive, has no grander goal than to earn his wage, while the unnamed narrator is fascinated with the physical struggle the hidden histories of her companions, and the wonder of the mountain before them. During their attempted first ascent, walls break down, stories are shared, and life-altering decisions are made. Acts that separate, unite, and ultimately separate the three climbers. Tensions build when the narrator photographs Cash's offerings to the mountain. Always little things he leaves. A string of raisins, a red band from his hair, a small white stone. And these tensions are only heightened by Mateo's revelation that a superstitious belief, long held by the neighboring peoples of the mountain, warns that the summit is, in fact, home to an ancient dragon. Initially dismissed by the narrator, the myth continues to persist. The dragon's existence, denied by Mateo and upheld by Cash, begins to linger over all three, much like the summit of the mountain. As the three characters climb, they get closer not only to the summit, but to each other. Framed through the narrator's camera lens, Gusanos explores the motivations, mysticism, and memories of its characters against the stark backdrop of a striking and potentially lethal environment. So that's a little bit about my story. And now I just wanted to kind of give you a feel of it by reading 3 sections. I divided the piece into 16 sections, and there isn't a lot of overt transition between them. I'm going to begin with reading the first 2 sections and then end the 7th. Section 1. Mateo got me drunk and told me about his mother's parties. I stared at my reflection in the half-empty glass and locked myself in the white organza and tulle, the light strings and floating lanterns. Mateo masked his familiar scent with cigarettes and cologne, but I could still smell the sweat lacquering his forearms, Argentina moist on his dark skin. He bought another round of tequila, and we drank to Cash in the mountain, my throat raw and roaring, the drowned pink worm dancing against my lips like a second tongue. The small room filled up with eyes watching this Principe and his boyish gringa. I leaned on the bar and laughed like my father, Mateo spinning words into worlds and building horizons with his long hands. He vomited later, outside in the dark, his broad shoulders heaving like great shuddering wings. I held back his long hair, the black strands ash against my rough palms. Standing, he rubbed spit from his cheek and looked at me. I found him beautiful, and the lack of the camera weighed on me. There was a photo of him from earlier that week when we had met in Buenos Aires, another from the train when he had fallen asleep against his own hand, a third from 2 days before when he had tied a blue bandana around his head and grinned at me from under the shadow of his pack. That was a different Mateo, and I began to see the man who summited mountains. We hiked down to the Pueblito and turned toward camp. In the silence, I felt the finger-like touches of the peak on my shoulders. The wait was almost over. Section 2. We forded the river, crossed the valley, ate dried mangoes, and watched the sun begin its ascent of the sky. Under the weight of the mountain shadow, Cash rubbed his palms against his thighs and thought. I took his picture because of the look on his face, the lines around his eyes like striking claws. He flipped his head, and the curling tip of his braids snapped against the gear on his back, asking to be touched. Behind me, Teo was singing, and if his Spanish could have been tasted, it would have lingered like caramel, elastic and soft. Cash spat, and I framed the mountain in my lens, tracing the steep lines, the steep walls of the eastern side. Beneath the lightweight fabric of my clothes, the fine hairs of my body rose up. And Cash, who felt something like this, ran his knuckles over the smooth rock, tilting his head back as though listening. Section 7. Things started happening. The wrong things. It was too hot. I tied my extra clothes to the loops on my pack. Laboring up the mountain trails, I was a rash of colors, bright reds and yellows, pure blue and summer sea green, sleeves falling about, flapping. Cash pulled a pink bandana around his forehead and watched the mountain. Teo, ignoring the thaw and the shuddering weight of snow before us, told me stories, half aware of my camera. Teo adjusted his stride to mine, brushed his hands through his hair. Los abuelos used to tell stories about a dragon on this mountain, how it set the foothills on fire, swallowed the old village. You've seen the burn area, the scorch marks. The gnarled obsidian trees, smooth like sand and oddly scentless, covered most of the the southern side. Thistle and flagging weeds rustled in the charred roots. Years later, still nothing else had grown. They still leave things for it: goats, sheep, little bits of metal. I thought of the faces in the bar the night we had been in the Pueblito. There had been some strangers in them, and I remembered with sudden clarity a young man reaching out to touch my hair. The gente don't even like to climb much further up than the foothills. The men like to say it's because the dirt isn't good for farming, but the women don't hide the reason. Did you see the kids running around in the pueblo? The women teach them to make little dolls, and they leave them in the trees around the mountain. Just little things for the dragon. I thought of Cash, of the offerings he'd left and that I still carried with me, sealed in photographs. Cash remained silent, his face almost tender. He was almost always looking upward. All right, so that's the first, there's the 3 sections from my story. I kind of want to talk about the creative process now. This is the fun part for me as a writer. I like talking about what I do, so I hope I don't go overboard. I have to give a lot of credit for this to Grinnell professor and writer, Professor Dean Petropoulos. I took his craft fiction class and ended up writing a story for that, and he ended up being very instrumental during the entire editing process. So I got this assignment to write a story, and I guess I had to think about this a lot. And I ended up spending a lot of time just sitting outside. I had just come from a summer working in a national forest, and so nature was really on my mind. And then, having that interest, I ended up reading an article in Sierra Club magazine that was actually about mountain climbing. So I had that, and then I had this summer where I also ended up working with Hopi Native Americans, who have a very interesting and complex way of relating to their environment. So in sitting around, I kept coming back to those 2 things. I'll start talking about the Sierra Club article. It was called Cinema Vertigo, and it was by Emmett Berg. It was about the attempted first ascent of Mount Edgar in China by 3 climbers, Johnny Cope, Micah Dash, and Wade Johnson. Now, Cope and Dash were the 2 professional climbers, and Johnson was actually there to just document that climb for National Geographic so that they could sell it and make a profit. He's also a Carleton grad, in case anyone's wondering. So what happened is they were out doing this pretty dangerous climb, and the weather really turned against them. And they spent a lot of time thinking about it. They spent a lot of money to get out there. They had a lot of gear, but they decided that this is too dangerous. We need to go back down. But earlier on, they had stashed about $40,000 worth of gear a little higher up on the mountain, and so they decided, we'll go get that gear, and then we'll come down. Unfortunately, in doing that, an avalanche occurred and killed all 3 of them. And so this really kind of raised the idea in the climbing community about filming, about money, about making this profitable, and this really sad thing that occurred. And I really could relate to that. I think especially, Johnson being a Carleton grad, and I go to Grinnell, and they're fairly similar schools. So that really stuck with me. And also the idea of why they were even there. I mean, no one makes you go climb a mountain. Why do you do that? The kind of brutal physicality of that climb and the decisions that led them to be there were really interesting to me. So I was thinking about that, and I started thinking about how it relates to our environment and why it's important that we do that and the different ways that we do that. Which kind of naturally brought me back to my own experiences, and that brought me back to this summer. I was awarded an internship with the Grinnell alum, Neil Weintraub, who's an archaeologist in the Kaibab National Forest, which is in Arizona, 2 hours south of the Grand Canyon. It's the largest pine forest in the States, if you're wondering. And it was a great internship. I got to work with a bunch of different really interesting people. And one of my favorite experiences was working on the Hopi Reservation. One of my coworkers was Hopi, so we got a little more insider a view of that life than most people. And for me, it was a totally new experience. I lived in the Midwest. I'd never been on a Native American reservation before. I hadn't experienced that culture. And so kind of in doing that, I really got to learn about it and their very spiritual way of relating to the earth. We got to visit a site that's very sacred to them. You have to go with someone who's Hopi, and they actually do make offerings to the spirits there. That's very important to them. And actually, on our way back from this incredible rock art site, our guide, Donald was his name, pointed to a mesa, and he said, "A dragon lives there." And I was like, okay, a dragon lives there. I didn't know anything about what was going on. I mean, I'm a total outsider. I don't know their culture. I mean, we just, made offerings, and he's picked up this dead bird on the ground to use the feathers, and I'm like, okay, a dragon lives there, and he's very serious. And I didn't quite know what to do with that. And so there's the idea that people could still believe this so strongly and relate to it, and then our environment and this harrowing experience that I read about earlier, these two ideas really clashed, and that kind of became the moment where Gusanos was born for me. And it was really interesting how both of those, that kind of creative process then played into some of the more technical aspects of the piece and how I kind of went through the mechanics of it. For the point of view, I had a first person from a white female photographer, which I really did for two reasons. One was I wanted to kind of heighten the photographer aspect because that is what had really drawn me, to the Mount Edgar expedition. And then the also one that I wanted to get at was the outsider, because when I was on the Hopi Reservation, that was me. And so, for me, I thought being an outsider really unsettles you and makes you uncertain of how to act, which makes you a really dynamic kind of character. So for those two reasons, I made, a photographer to, capture everything, and then also a white female to her two companions who are both men who, speak Spanish and have a very strong tie to Latin America. And then another technical aspect that was really informed by my creative process was the voice. And again, I had kind of two reasons for using the voice that I did. The first was to just kind of reinforce the narrator as a photographer. I kind of relied on a lot of camera references. I say at one point, I learned about these two men through my camera lens. I took his picture because of the look on his face, the lines around his eyes. And I really wanted to underscore that the person who was doing this was really trying to frame a scene. They were really trying to get details, which was also useful for me as a writer because I wanted to describe the setting, and that seemed like a very organic way to move into that. I also wanted the idea of distance as well, because I think when someone photographs something, they're capturing it, but they're also creating, they're kind of blocking from it, which is another interesting aspect for me. And then the second part of the voice that I really wanted to underscore was the physicality of the journey and that kind of physical tension. And to do that, I worked on with body imagery, so just a lot of descriptions of what their bodies are doing and how their bodies are contacting each other. At one point I say, Teo pushed forward, his hair falling into the thin spaces between my chin and the turn of color of my coat. And also, I think, along with that physicality, I had to discuss physical pain, because I think anyone who's trying to climb a mountain that's really hard has to have some weird fascination with pain. Good or bad, I don't know. So I definitely wanted to address that beautiful, strange struggle, which I thought, which kind of came through in the reflective nature of the narrator. And so kind of with the voice and with the point of view, I wanted someone who is visually perceptive and willing to ask the question why. Why are we here? Why are we doing this thing that is so hard and perhaps unnatural? I don't know, up for you to decide. Yeah, and then I guess the last point I want to touch on before I finish is how I broke the piece up into different sections. I didn't want to transition between them. I liked the idea of keeping pieces contained within each other. And I thought that by allowing myself to kind of do Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, and break up into 16 sections allowed me to do that. To advance by being reflective, to advance by being, plot through dialogue, or to advance by action. And I could juxtapose them in a way that I thought was perhaps more interesting and also less work for me as the writer, which was nice. Yeah, so thank you. I'm going to end with a last excerpt, and just want to again reiterate thank you to the ACM and to all the judges, and especially to Regina Frangelico. This is my last section. I thought about the worms, many-hearted, their bodies naked of defense, eyes little more than holes in their heads. Their rubbery bodies give the illusion of jumping life on a fiery weight of tequila, the chalked-in lines scrawling with ecstatic black frenzy along the mountain walls. The scarred purple, shiny inhaled corpses in Cash's cornmeal. I felt Cash under one hand, his ribs like a perpetual series of rise and fall valleys, his heart a cautious expanding and contracting. Mateo folded to me, our legs a tangle of shins and knee bones. His breath still smelled like Argentinian dirt as it warmed the sea-bone behind my ear, and when he moved, his nose dragged coldness and blood into my hair. I wished its redness could give him more. The tendrils from my scalp should have snapped and growled, should have burned holes to my body, should have shed embers and devoured us in ashes. I thought of the mountain and its teeth against my skin. felt distant from my own flesh. I had come here to feel and to become. I had come here to test and to defy. I had not come here to die. Thank you.